What has happened, everybody? James Hancock here. I'm back to review Maestro, a biopic about the life of legendary composer and conductor Leonard Bernstein. The film's directed by and stars Bradley Cooper, and I caught it Tuesday at a press screening at the New York Film Festival. And I should mention that the screening was in the Walter Reed Theater, which is on this little stretch of West 65th Street between Broadway and Amsterdam, which was renamed Leonard Bernstein Place in Bernstein's honor. So the location felt ideal for the screening, and luckily a lot of the crew was in attendance for a press conference after the show, but sadly Bradley Cooper was not in attendance. But if you've not yet marked your calendar for this movie, it's scheduled for limited theatrical release on November 22nd, and it's going to drop on Netflix on December 20th. So that's a long way away, and not to worry, I won't be giving away any spoilers or any key scenes in this review. But after seeing the movie on Tuesday, I did want to sit on my reaction a bit instead of reviewing it right away, because there's so much about this film on the surface that's incredibly impressive, showing a massive evolution on Bradley Cooper's part in terms of his skills as a director. But I can't pretend that I was completely in love with the movie. It was one of those situations where I was impressed with it, and I'll continue to take an interest in Bradley Cooper's future directing efforts. But 2 days later, I'm stuck with more of a lingering impression of the ingredients that did not work for me rather than those ingredients which did. So I'm going to do my best to call attention to these strengths and weaknesses without giving anything away, which is kind of like trying to tap dance across several laser beams. But we're going to do the best that we can. But it gives me no pleasure to report that Maestro is not the obvious crowd pleaser that his previous movie, A Star Is Born, turned out to be. Maestro is basically Oscar bait. It's Bradley Cooper hunting for prestige. He wants awards. But there are times where it feels like his reach might exceed his grasp with this movie, and that it's kind of a mixed bag of soaring ambition with the occasional clumsy execution. On the other hand, though, it's like, do you want filmmakers not to take risks? Do you want filmmakers not to make big creative gambles? I might not be completely in love with the final product, but I love seeing Bradley Cooper trying to rise to the occasion with every technical and dramatic trick that he can think of. So let's start with the fact that Bradley Cooper really had his work cut out for him. He was initially brought on just to star in the movie when Martin Scorsese was considering directing, and then Steven Spielberg was considering directing, but he dropped out to direct West Side Story, which is a fresh adaptation of one of Leonard Bernstein's most famous creations. But according to what I heard at the press conference, when Spielberg backed out, Bradley Cooper said, "Look, I just finished directing my first feature film, A Star Is Born. I'd really love it if y'all would consider allowing me to direct Maestro." So he invited Steven Spielberg to a screening of A Star Is Born, and apparently about 20 minutes into it, Spielberg leaned over to Bradley Cooper and said, "You're directing this fucking movie." And after that, Bradley Cooper was off to the races. And according to screenwriter Josh Singer, who was in attendance at the press conference, he said Bradley Cooper's first move was insisting upon a page-one rewrite of the screenplay. And usually, if an actor or a director insists upon a page-one rewrite, the first thing that happens is that the screenwriter gets fired and you bring in a new writer. But Josh Singer, he stayed on board and he worked side by side with Bradley Cooper, and they went through this giant, exhaustive process that involved a lot of interviews with the family of Leonard Bernstein. Without their green light and without their okay, this movie would not happen. And so they were very basically intimately involved in the production of this film. And while previous iterations of the screenplay had adhered to much more of a traditional biopic format, what Bradley Cooper wanted to do is shift the focus away from the traditional biopic and focus more on the relationship between Bernstein and his wife, actress Felicia Montealegre, played by Carey Mulligan. The two of them were together for many years. They had 3 children. But what makes their relationship much more complex than your average showbiz marriage is that Leonard Bernstein continued to have many affairs with men while married to Felicia, and over time, he started to become increasingly kind of blasé and sloppy about keeping it a secret. And also, keep in mind, this story takes place from the 1940s through the 1980s, when keeping this aspect of the marriage a secret was much more essential to both of their careers. And even though Felicia says she always knew who her husband was from day one, there's no getting around the fact that if you have one person in a marriage who's constantly cheating on the other, it's going to wreak havoc on your personal lives, and obviously it has a negative impact on the kids as well. So this movie is much more interested in the internal lives of the family as opposed to really dwelling on all the musical accomplishments of Leonard Bernstein. They do pause from time to time to show him conducting or teaching students, etc. and so forth. But looking at the movie as a whole, I think tackling so many years might have been a mistake from a structural standpoint. I mean, 40 years, that's a hell of a lot of time to compress into a 2-hour movie. And the question always is, which personal and professional milestones should make the cut, and how much time and attention should be devoted to each of them? And in the end, will that feel like a satisfying story with a clear beginning, middle, and end that works as a movie? And I think on the whole, it does, because the audience didn't seem restless during it. Usually, if a movie's not playing well, you can just see people checking their phones, or they're talking, or they're constantly getting up, or they're shifting in their seat. It felt like the audience very much was like under the spell of the movie, more or less. And occasionally the movie has these soaring sequences, like the scene where Leonard Bernstein gets his first major opportunity as a conductor. That might be Bradley Cooper's finest hour as a filmmaker so far. And during these sequences from the late 40s, you can tell that Bradley Cooper was trying to show off everything that he's learned about filmmaking technique when it comes to having a camera like whizzing from one location to another, sometimes in ways that make sense emotionally but not logically, in terms of like how they would construct certain locations where they could have one seamless camera movement where you're moving from one building to another, just to show him like leaping out of bed and then right into the theater where he's conducting and so on and so forth. I think a lot of people will be very impressed by the technological virtuosity on his part. Whether or not they will compare favorably to some of the camera movements by somebody like Martin Scorsese, well, that is up for every viewer to decide for themselves. But there are also many scenes where I found myself kind of horrified by what felt like very loose, very improvisational scenes where the actors, aka the inmates, had taken over the asylum, given free rein to indulge in some of their worst impulses. And I'm talking about some of the cocktail parties and some of the family bonding scenes where, because of the setting, the story naturally features a lot of characters who are quote-unquote like artistic elites in the world of classical music. And as a result, a lot of the cast resorts to these really horrible accents that sound incredibly inauthentic, at least when being used by those actors in question. And the accents come across like an affectation where the actors are trying really hard to sound overly sophisticated, like basically the richest snobs that you can find in the city of New York. But only Carey Mulligan really seems talented enough to pull it off. As far as the rest of the cast is concerned, there are a lot of times where they just sound like they're completely full of shit. And from what I heard at the press conference, Bradley Cooper went to great lengths trying to learn how to mimic or imitate Leonard Bernstein's unique speaking voice, and his voice did change throughout his life. He was a constant chain smoker. I mean, there's not a scene in this movie where Bradley Cooper is not just smoking away. I mean, like, goddamn, like, do you really want to smoke that much? Like, there might be some consequences down the road, but goddamn, he was, in for a penny, in for a pound. There's like, from the moment he wakes up to the moment he goes to sleep, just chain smoking all day, every day. But as a result, his voice did get deeper over time. But in the movie, Bradley Cooper had this nasal device plugged up in that would make him sound a little more nasally and a little deeper. But he also is using that like affected way of speaking, which sometimes for me rang a little hollow. And as the movie progresses, he increasingly leans into what feels more like a caricature than a character. And it's like the emotions are there, but in terms of just his speaking voice, perhaps the movie would have been more effective if Bradley Cooper had just talked like Bradley Cooper, because I think there'll be a decent number of people, I can't speak for everybody, but I think a decent number of people, more or less kind of half, will probably be distracted by the way he's expressing himself and the way he's speaking as opposed to getting invested in the story. And as the movie continued to unfold, I was reminded of a phrase often used by author Bret Easton Ellis, and it's not meant as a compliment, where he refers to certain performances as acting with a capital A. And the way I interpret that kind of withering, condescending criticism of some actors' technique, the craft is too obvious, where you can tell the actor's making such a pronounced effort in terms of the accent and the posture, and like they're basically, it's like somebody in the theater on the stage and they're acting for people in the back row, which is very theatrical. But in the context of a movie, sometimes it feels artificial, because with a movie, the camera oftentimes is right up close, and yeah, anytime you have a close-up, gotta kind of dial things back just a little bit, or can come across as overly intense. And I feel like a lot of the acting in this feels overly intense, overly theatrical, and obviously, given the setting, the world of musical theater and composing scores for movies and Broadway shows in the 40s and 50s, clearly you're gonna have a lot of theatrical personalities, but I feel like they might have just overdone it just a tad. And I feel like the real creative challenge with a movie like this is trying to find the balance between the personal relationships, the personal drama, which we can all relate to, those are universal themes, but also balancing that with the career of a great artist, something that's very elusive and out of reach for most of us. And the reason this movie's getting made all these years later is because of Leonard Bernstein's undeniable achievements as a musician. And just to remind you of some of his many achievements, the guy won 7 Emmys, 2 Tonys, 16 Grammys, including a Lifetime Achievement Award. And as a composer, he wrote symphonies, he wrote orchestral music, he wrote ballets, film and theater music, choral works, opera, chamber music, a lot of stuff for the piano. And I'm most familiar with this stuff that got incorporated into certain movies. Like, he wrote the score for one of my all-time favorite movies, On the Waterfront, starring Marlon Brando. And obviously, West Side Story is one of the most popular musicals on the stage and in the theater ever. I mean, Steven Spielberg's remake flopped, but the original one was a massive hit. But as somebody who's a giant film history nerd, I was honestly just hoping for a lot more scenes about the movies that are either adaptations of his musicals or just movies that incorporate his scores. I mean, On the Waterfront is one of my all-time favorite movies, and Leonard Bernstein's score for that is just bone-chilling. It is so moving and so mysterious, and it just perfectly sets the atmosphere and the tone, where you can't even imagine that movie without Leonard Bernstein's score. I absolutely fucking love it. But we've all seen movies in the past that handle this juggling act very successfully. I feel like Amadeus is the perfect home run of balancing the personal life of Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart and his professional career. We see the operas, we see Don Giovanni, we see the magic flute, but we also see the substance abuse and like the screaming fights with his wife and his father, and just I felt like everything about that movie. It just worked. I mean, I've lost track of how many times I've seen Amadeus, and it won a shitload of Oscars, did very well theatrically, and there's a reason why 40 years later people are still watching Amadeus. But just in the last year, we've seen a couple movies in this subgenre. I mean, Tar was based on a fictitious conductor, but that movie also balanced her professional life and her personal life and her scandals very successfully. Or even Elvis. Elvis was a mixed bag, and Elvis is not as good as Maestro. But I feel like Elvis in the second half did a really good job of capturing like the 1968 TV special, as well as his final tour, or not, his final performance in Vegas. Thought he did a good job of really like slowing down and focusing on those key professional milestones. Maestro, I feel like it misses those professional milestones, or at least it misses them to the degree that I would like to see them explored, just because I'm naturally just interested or more interested in his work as an artist as opposed to his personal life. But the big question moving forward is, can lightning strike twice in the same place? Because remaking A Star is Born with Lady Gaga, that's obviously inherently much more commercial. I mean, that story's been done several times from the 30s up to the present day, and I imagine in 10 or 15 years, somebody will do A Star is Born all over again. Like that format is not going anywhere, where you have one star on the way down, one star on the way up, and they fall in love in the middle. It's just classic. And I remember when that trailer first dropped, people lost their goddamn minds. I don't remember anybody losing their minds over the trailer to Maestro when it dropped. I feel like it's going to be very niche in its appeal because, Lady Gaga's one of the world's biggest pop stars, and Leonard Bernstein, while he's one of the most important musical figures of the 20th century, that doesn't necessarily translate to giant box office with a big crowd. But this is Netflix. This is not a traditional studio. I imagine it's going to get a limited theatrical run. The question remains, will people flock to it on Netflix? And I'm rooting hard for this movie to find the right audience that feels like this is a movie made for them. But I have a feeling it's going to have the same level of appeal as a movie like Mank, David Fincher's movie about the screenwriter of Citizen Kane. It was niche. It was about film history. It did find an audience, but it wasn't like a runaway success story. But I think there's evidence in this flick that Bradley Cooper is continuing to grow as a director, and the good news is he's still young enough. We might have decades of potentially good movies to look forward to if he can stay on this path. Because first and foremost, there's no denying Bradley Cooper's dedication, his work ethic, his tireless efforts to do the best job that he possibly could. Apparently, according to makeup artist Kazuhiro, who was there at the screening, Bradley would sit in the makeup chair for 5 hours in the morning for the scenes where he's slightly older, Bernstein, and then he would have to direct and act all day. Like, just acting in a movie or just directing a movie can be completely, totally exhausting and can just knock you flat. But to sit in a makeup chair for hours and then start your day, Jesus fucking Christ. And obviously at that time, while doing all that, he's having to juggle all the usual stressful concerns of being a filmmaker, but at the same time, also trying to keep the family happy. I mean, he was juggling a lot of flaming batons, and also he's struggling to live up to the potential, or what might have been, if the movie had been directed by either Martin Scorsese or Steven Spielberg, two of the most beloved filmmakers of the last 50 years. So Bradley Cooper, he was under a lot of fucking stress, but I think he more or less delivered. I think if I were giving him a letter grade on a report card, I would give him a B or a B+. And as an actor, even though I didn't really like the accent he was using in the movie, he did have to play a lot of piano. I don't know how much piano playing Bradley Cooper done before making this movie, but he has to do a lot of it in this flick. And he has to conduct. And Leonard Bernstein was famous for conducting with a lot of emotion. That was kind of one of the innovations that he brought to the table, is that he would weep and sweat, and he'd get really into it. And even his small gestures had a lot of kind of emotional weight. And Bradley Cooper went all in on that, but he also hired a conductor to teach him how to conduct properly. And so while the conductor said Bradley Cooper's not going to be, conducting the Philharmonic anytime soon, but he more or less had to learn like the basics in order to be convincing on the screen. And I think one of the most interesting aspects of the movie is showing the different sides of Leonard Bernstein's personality, because part of him was a serious introvert, somebody who would like to sit in a room just writing music all day, and he wanted to create a giant body of work. On the other hand, he was your classic extrovert. He loved people, genuinely loved people, loved being around people. Like, he's one of those people that wants people around at all times, and also loves having sex with people. He was a people person, and he loves performing for a crowd and having them, he loves the adoration of the masses. And so he's completely, totally narcissistic in that respect, but trying to figure out, like, how does one balance those two warring sides of his personality, all but trying to have a marriage and a family and all these things. And yeah, as we see, he is a flawed human being. He's a great human being who accomplished great things, but he has many personal shortcomings that negatively impacted the people that were closest to him. And my favorite part of the movie was watching Bradley Cooper's experiments with the sequences from the 40s that are in black and white, where he and his director of photography, Matthew Libatique, who previously shot a lot of Darren Aronofsky movies, but you can tell they looked at this movie as an opportunity to pay homage to all their favorite DPs from the late 40s and early 50s, people like John Alton or James Wong Ho or Greg Toland. And sometimes these sequences don't completely come together. They don't completely match because he's trying to experiment with so many different formats. Well, wait a second, now the whole look of the movie has changed. However, I respect and admire them sticking with a 4:3 aspect ratio and basically doing half the movie in black and white. So those early sequences are very easy on the eyes and some of the best black and white photography that I've seen in a long time. So as I said before, there's a lot about this movie that's incredibly impressive. There's a lot about this movie that will hold your interest. There's a lot about this movie that's interesting, and the reason I hate using the word interesting to describe any movie, I can remember going to a lot of film festivals in the early 2000s with my friends who went to the American Film Institute in LA. And whenever they were watching their friends' short films or their features on the big screen afterwards, they never wanted to criticize their friends because they wanted to be supportive. And I'd say, oh, what did you think of such and such? And say, oh, I thought it was interesting. And it was the most non-committal way to say, yeah, I thought it was boring and I wasn't interested, but I want my friend to do well in their career, so I'm going to say their movie was interesting. So I always try to avoid saying that because it's a dodge. You're dodging, you're making a non-committal effort at being complimentary and non-complimentary all at once. So Maestro, I did find it interesting. And I think a lot of people are going to find it interesting. I don't know how many people are going to love it. Like A Star is Born, people fucking freaked out. And when Bradley Cooper and Lady Gaga performed at the Oscars, I can remember one of my sisters calling me they're in love. Emotionally, that story, people got really invested in it, and I don't think people are going to be as emotionally invested by Maestro. I think they'll be intellectually invested. I think they'll go back and listen to some of Leonard Bernstein's music. I think they'll go back and watch some of the, because there's a ton of footage of him conducting and a ton of footage of him educating the next generation of conductors coming up underneath him. And that's where he is, for a lot of musicians, most famous in his efforts on the part of, or his efforts in the world of education. So I'll be very curious to see what people have to say once people actually start watching it. I mean, Netflix has a massive built-in audience that at a minimum, oh, new Bradley Cooper movie. I'll give it a shot. Whether or not they'll watch it to the end, all that remains to be seen. But I think that's all I can say without giving away some serious spoilers. So I'm going to go ahead and wrap up this video. Hope you enjoyed my interesting, non-committal, ambivalent reaction to this movie. It's one of those movies where I showed up hoping it would be one of the best movies of the year, but the New York Film Festival has had a lot of really cool flicks. I think I've seen 10 so far, and maybe of those 10 so far, Anatomy of a Fall and Poor Things have been the two that I enjoyed the most. But I'm glad I saw Maestro, and I'll be curious to see how people respond when it starts hitting theaters in November, and obviously once it hits Netflix in December. But thank you so much for watching my review. I greatly appreciate it. If you enjoyed it, please consider liking the video, subscribing to the channel, hitting that notification bell, and hunting me down on Twitter at Colbrax if you want to talk more about movies. But thanks again for watching. I really appreciate it. But more importantly, as always, onwards and upwards.